So, we're going to start with Dark Souls because that's kind of the start of the conversation, right? A lot of players, maybe most of them, skipped Demon Souls when it came out, and like most other aspects of that game, the themes weren't as well developed as they'd become in Dark Souls. And if we're going to talk about Dark Souls in politics, we kinda gotta start by talking about fascism. For a lot of people, fascism is readily apparent in Dark Souls. Others think it's not there at all. And, well, in that regard, while it's usually hyperbole to compare characters to Hitler, I do believe there's a direct connection here, which comes in the form of esoteric Hitlerism, which sounds fake but is an actual scholarly term, and a book called The Lightning and the Sun. Now, the title is immediately intriguing, right? But what the fuck is that? Well, The Lightning and the Motherfucking Sun, written by Savitri Goddamn Devi, posits that history is divided in cycles that alternate between an age of dark and a golden age. Sounds familiar? Dark ages are associated with death, chaos, and the worship of mankind above the divine. Golden ages are spearheaded by this atemporal force that incarnates as leaders, rising up against the encroaching dark, who also double as the titular lightning and the sun. The sun is a man, quote unquote, above time, marked by an idealistic view of the world and an almost innocent kind of benevolence that makes him ultimately ineffective against the dark. In the book, this incarnation comes in the form of a pharaoh called Akhenaten. Akhenaten. Akhenaten? Fuck my pronunciation. And in Dark Souls, that's where we get the association between sunlight and healing miracles, the ever-soothing princess of sunlight, etc. The lightning, on the other hand, is a man, quote unquote, in time, who is guided by the same basic principles as the sun, but values action above idealism, which ultimately leads him astray from the path that would bring about the Golden Age. Savitri says that would have been Genghis Khan for some goddamn reason, and in the game that's where we get lightning bolts as the ultimate expression of divine martial power. And then, finally, we have the man, quote unquote, against time, who embodies both the lightning and the sun, the ideals and the action, both the universal benevolence of the Golden Order and the ruthlessness necessary to bring about its golden age. For Devi, that is, of fucking course, none other than Adolf motherfucking brain-splattering Sieg-Heiling Hitler himself. For Miyazaki, that's Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, hurler of lightning bolts. Guinevere and the Nameless King are the lightning and the sun as individual components, and Gwyn is the sum of those parts. Like Hitler, Gwyn kinda killed himself by burning at the first flame, and like Gwyn, Devi believed Hitler was either alive or about to reincarnate back from the dead. Keeping in mind that, according to Savitri Devi, the source of all evil during the Age of Dark is the dissolution of the natural hierarchy that distinguishes the castes of man, and that the point of the Golden Age is to bring peace to the world by reinstating G's hierarchy, where the godlike superior Aryan race is ordained to rule over the lesser races of men. I can't stress enough how much this is pure, undistilled, blatant Nazi propaganda, written by an OG Nazi for the Nazis to come. And now, for your consideration, let us quote from the book itself. For destruction and creation are forever linked. That is why we adore the lightning as well as the sun. Men against time partake both of the sun and of the lightning, inasmuch as they are truly inspired by Golden Age ideals, and as they are compelled to display all the practical qualities of the man in time. He had understood more and more clearly that only if he could become a king would he, at last, be safe. The emperor of all men, in the Golden Family, his blood, his race, the ruling family of the world forever. The ideal city was to be built upon the state idea itself. It was to be the living expression of nothing less than the original Golden Age order in its uncompromising purity. Their ultimate goal was not the defense of the order as it stood, but nothing short of the seizure of the royal scepter in their own hands and the establishment, to their own profit, of a theocracy, of a regime under which both temporal and spiritual power would be theirs. This era was to be nothing less than the era of truth, the Golden Age, in which the world is governed by gods, real children of the sun, not for the greatest happiness of the greatest number of men, a decadent idea, but for the fulfillment of life's highest purpose, which is to be a conscious hymn to the sun. Greatest God! The lightning in the sun is kind of obscure, but it is known. I'm obviously not saying this is the only source of inspiration for the game, but I do honestly believe this book is definitely in that list. And this is a really, really, really bad book. Not just because it's Nazi bullshit, but also because it's just very poorly written and extremely stupid. I almost give myself a stroke trying to read this shit. But racism is stupid, and fascism is stupid. These are stupid ideologies championed by stupid people. But if it's stupid, and it kills you, your family, your friends, and everybody else who vaguely looks or sounds like you, then it's not just stupid. It's also dangerous, and it needs to be taken seriously, regardless of how dumb it may be. Savitri Devi and her writings played a direct role in the perpetuation, expansion, and modernization of Nazism after World War II. Normal people may not know about these references and connections, but Nazis do, and so do scholars, and so do brain-damaged lay people paying attention to what stupid Nazis are doing. Dark Souls has an explicitly political text. Miyazaki is a literal social scientist, and Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, is his esoteric fucking Hitler. So now we have a more than likely connection to Hitler, but what about fascism? Well, fascism is a modern phenomenon, and as such, it doesn't graft perfectly to Dark Souls. But Not only that's to be expected from a fantasy allegory of a modern society, that's also on par with fascism itself, since it's generally not categorized by a strict, hyper-specific definition. Umberto Eco listed a number of characteristics in his Fascism essay, a number of which is found in every configuration of fascism, but not all at the same time. Franco, Mussolini, Hitler's governments were all different, but they were all fascists. Emilio Gentile talked about fascism as a political religion that used myths and symbols to create a totalitarian state that controlled every aspect of society, and Stanley Payne kinda defined fascism through their negations, goals, and aesthetics. Regarding negations, in the anti-liberalism column, we have in Dark Souls an anti-democratic, top-down caste system that conducts undead hunts, for instance. For anti-communism, we have the accumulation of wealth in Anor Londo and a lack of human cooperation, which is incentivized and sustained by the gods. And in the anti-conservatism, we have the end of the natural order, right? A lot of people tend to see fascism as a purely conservative movement, but it's not. At least not exactly. Fascism seeks radical change from the previous order, whether that's the Nazis breaking off from the Weimar Republic, or in the case of Dark Souls, the gods taking over the world of the ancient dragons, which, bearing any evidence to the contrary, seems to have been a more egalitarian one. There's no evidence of a hierarchy within the ranks of the ancient dragons, and the gods were born underground. That's where they built their first civilization, around the kiln of the first flame. There's no evidence of aggression or oppression from the airborne surface dragons against the rapidly multiplying Morlocks living beneath the trees. As far as we can tell, the dragons were just chilling. Then one day, ants with machine guns and chemical weapons started crawling out of the ground and killing everything in sight. Regarding their goals, there was to be the creation of a new nationalist authoritarian state for the organization of a regulated and integrated national economic structure, aimed at the creation of an empire fueled by an idealist voluntarist creed to realize a modern, self-determined culture. Anor Londo is an authoritarian state with a self-regulated soul-based economy. They influence the standardized outside coin-based economy. The creed is there, the self-determined culture is there, the empire is definitely fucking there. And regarding aesthetics, in Payne's definition of fascism, there's mass mobilization, an emphasis on romantic and mystical aspects, an exaltation of violence, male dominance in youth, and a tendency toward charismatic authoritarian leadership. And that's just an Orlando to a T, right? Their culture, their politics, it's all there, right? Fascism is also often described as an ideology of contradictions. It's radically progressive but morally conservative. It's fundamentally oppressive in its dispensation of freedom and prosperity. It seeks peace through violence. Its populism overtly seeks to elevate its people to an elite status. Fascists are the strongest, but also the most vulnerable, beset by enemies who are pitifully weak, but also so powerful they're an existential threat on a global scale. And while all that sounds really stupid, these contradictions aren't a bug, they're a feature. These contradictions prime their followers to abandon critical thinking. Since you can't reason your way either against or out of an irrational ideology. Fascists were and still are obsessed with futurism while wrapping themselves up in myths of a fictional golden age. And Orlando builds sewage systems and perpetual motion mechanisms while very literally wrapping themselves up in myths of a golden age. The undead hunts and worship of the gods are supposed to bring salvation to the humans, whom they had literally cursed with the dark sign that is responsible for either the death or hollowing from which we seek salvation in the first place. Depending on the state of decay of the first flame on any given day. And like these are all the contradictions inherent to the system, and the gods are, again, the literal embodiment of the fascist power scale dichotomy. Clearly superior, yet extremely vulnerable. If their campfire goes out, they die. Beset by enemies who are supposed to be insignificant in comparison, but that have the power to undo their entire civilization if left unchecked. So yeah, and Orlando and the gods and their ideologies, they just fit perfectly with the known definitions of fascism, right? Everything is there. Now, when it comes to the relation between gods and humans, it's worth noting that humans are not the only oppressed people here. Fascism always needs an enemy to fight. Generally speaking, that serves to galvanize their movement in an us versus them mentality, and to justify their philosophy of violence as well. But that's also an incremental tool that erodes liberalism and democracy, which is something Carl Schmitt wrote about and that went on to help define the Nazi playbook. You find a group that's generally accepted to be persecuted, and you draw a line separating them from the rest of society. You give the people something to rally against, while removing the persecuted group from the mechanisms of power. Then, once that has been normalized, you find another group and do the same thing. The time scale slowly concentrates power in the hands of a gradually smaller group of people, while facilitating complicity from the groups who are not yet being persecuted. First they came for the communists, then they came for the Jews, then they came for me. At first, everybody stood together against the ancient dragons. The three elder gods, the humans and the giants. It's debatable whether they started with the giants or the humans, but these two groups were subsequently ostracized. The humans were branded and the giants were enslaved. Then Orlando declared war on Izalith. The undead hunts also targeted Nito's necromancers, not just the undead. They keep carving people out. All these can also help us draw some more lines in the initial comparison we made to Nazism specifically, right? Because these are all definitions of fascism, but Nazism is a specific kind of fascism. For most people, when they think about Nazis, the first things that probably come to mind are, besides the funny-looking little man with a Chaplin mustache, racial purity, genocide, and concentration camps, right? This is, you think Nazis, that comes to mind. The war against the ancient dragons was an act of genocide. The game never talks about it on those terms, but that's what it was. That was a war of extermination. Every single dragon must die. With the exception of Sif, of course, who chose to side with the gods and who was, incidentally, well, fuck. Who was white enough to be counted among the ranks, I guess, like, not literally, that was an in-universe argument that they had amongst themselves, but it is figurative of a real life factor. Yeah. So, Okay, Nazis were okay with working alongside outcasts, until such time when those outcasts became either useless or a threat. Right? Sif the Scaleless, Ancient Dragon. Useful ally. See, like, uh, the Nazis, going back to Nazis, there's their alliance with the racially inferior Japanese, right? Or, let's try to pronounce this, or Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm. Fuck him, he's a Nazi. Leader of the SA and biggest, very real threat to Hitler's supremacy within the Nazi party, who also happened to be gay. Until the SS killed him, Ernst Röhm. Then he was just a dead Nazi, who also happened to have been gay once. You know? Hitler wasn't always destined to be the leader of the Nazi party. There were others vying for the throne, and the biggest, arguably only realistic contender, real contender, an actual threat, was a gay Nazi. But I digress. Back to genocides. The invasion of Izalith was another war of extermination. Black Knights are still killing demons to this very day. And I'd argue the bringing of the Dark Sign was also an act of genocide, but that's debatable. And keeping in mind that genocide isn't restricted to just killing, right? So, yeah. Dark Souls was already talking about genocide back when it wasn't cool yet, I guess. I also mentioned concentration camps, and, well, there's the Undead Asylum, right? That's where we start the game, rotting inside a literal concentration camp. It really doesn't get more literal than that. And finally, there's racial purity. If we're talking about Nazis, right? The crown jewel in the aggregate heap of steaming shittiness that is the Nazi ideology. Much like the concept of race itself, the dichotomy between gods and humans is fabricated. At first glance, the gods of Anerlondo are categorically superior to us, since they're immortal creatures with godlike powers, unlike us feeble mortal beings. But we all came from the same proto-race of hollow-like, shambling corpses. Our destinies were defined by which souls they were arbitrarily finding on the ground. Gwyn reverts back to a hollow-like state once his soul has been spent in the first flame, and the first men are still alive and kicking. Humans are supposed to be immortal too, right? It's demonstrated by the first man. They had to literally fabricate a curse that would set us apart from them. And when it comes to their so-called godlike powers, honestly, we can kill them just fine. We can summon lightning bolts and kamehamehas and swing big sticks so hard their fragile godlike bodies literally explode in a cloud of melting snowflake tears. There's no actual difference. Figuratively, the only difference between us and them is that the gods have lost their humanity, and we're still fighting to keep ours. The gods propagandize themselves just like any other social movement, and the game presents them under the light of that propaganda. The game also gives us the information necessary to see past that veil of deception, But unfortunately, a lot of people don't take that step. Praising the sun and worshipping Gwyn as a tragic, benevolent ruler who was just doing the best he could is equivalent to buying into their propaganda. It makes collaborators out of the players and characters who buy into it. Nobody's immune to propaganda. Not even Solaire. Solaire is a genuinely good guy. He just wants to help. But by praising the sun while he does all that helping around, he's also helping to perpetuate the same power structure that literally created the curse which plagues us all and drives all the conflict in this world. To the players, Solaire is a friend. To the ruling class, he's just a useful idiot. And in the end, his quest to please his so-called superiors, to become just like them, invariably leads to him turning against those he once held dear. He found his very own son. He's just like the gods now. And he doesn't have to care about us, lowly undead, anymore. By the time we reach the kingdom of Lothric, there doesn't seem to be a drive for the expansion of the empire and no outside enemies left to fight. Groups have been rearranged, but the castes themselves seem to have settled. There's no distinction between the ruling class and the peasantry other than arbitrary birthright. Rosaria and Gwendolyn's divine lineages excluded, but they're not a class unto themselves, they're individuals in positions of power. And faith doesn't seem to serve the state more so than the other way around. Even King Lothric and, by extension, Prince Lothric have become hostages to the very same myths that once endowed Gwyn and all of the gods with absolute power. Anor Londo seems to have become more inclusive by opening its borders, accepting dark to some extent, making peace with Izalith, and shunning sunlight in favor of an eternally moonlit sky. In this era, fascism seems to have given way to a more run-of-the-mill kind of authoritarianism. This feels more like feudalism than the Third Reich to me, and so does Drangleic for that matter. One way or another, injustice, persecution, and suffering are still ingrained into the fabric of this world. One way or another, the state is always directly involved in the practical application of oppression. In each and every age, the masses are downtrodden by the ruling class, and we, the players, always start the game at the receiving end of tyranny. These games offer just enough information about their history, just enough representation to unheard voices, and just enough examples of abuse and inequality hiding in plain sight to let the players figure out by themselves why they should be fighting and who they should be fighting against. But understanding is not a given. Understanding is a challenge. Understanding is a challenge that each and every one of us must choose to take on. The truth will not be handed to us. There will be no simple answers, but we can learn, and we must learn because our lives depend on it. When Nepo baby snowflake dickheads with big egos, bigger guns, and even bigger bank accounts choose to dictate our fates for us, when they choose to harvest our lives for their Olympian feasts, forcing us to compete against each other for survival, forcing us to forsake the very humanity that distinguishes us from them, in order to have even the smallest semblance of a life worth living. That's when every one of us needs to find either a bottle or a brick and rise the fuck up. Not all oppression is fascist, but all Soulsborne games rise up against oppression. The members of the ruling class believe it is their divine mandate to rule. Well, Soulsborne and I, we believe that we all have a mandate to fight. Vos verebimini nocten, you goddamn motherfuckers. I'm certain people talk about environmentalism in Dark Souls, but honestly, I don't remember ever hearing anybody talk about environmentalism in Dark Souls. A generalized notion of pollution as a byproduct of progress has always been around and accompanied by a lot of poison. A whole lot of fucking poison. The aggregated filth of Lordran sewage systems accumulated in Blighttown and Harvest Valley turned into a poison gas hellscape due to greedy excavation practices. Those aren't enough to claim Dark Souls was some kind of green manifesto, though, and I can see why some people would overlook this theme in the first installment of the series. But then Dark Souls 3 came out, along with the Ringed City, and at that point, I think it should have become pretty clear Dark Souls had something to say about the subject. Our civilization starts with the first flame, and it ends with Filianor's Rest. We are literally burning a non-renewable power source that leads to a desert world at the end of time. It's fossil food, fuels, and climate change. Right? Like, that's a very clear parallel. We can even associate the first flame to scientific progress through the allegory of Prometheus. It's fossil fuels and climate change. Soulsborne's first game was released 10 years after Al Gore announced his candidacy, 5 years after The Day After Tomorrow hit the theaters, and exactly 5 fucking decades after Edward Teller first warned the world about the dangers of climate change. It's no big stretch to imagine a social scientist turned artist may have been aware of and talked about the biggest existential threat the world had ever known since we decided it was a good idea to split the fucking atom for the purposes of scorching the goddamn earth beneath the feet of our enemies through his mother fucking art. Now, think back to the very first thing we see in the very first on the very first cutscene of the very first Dark Souls game. That was a world of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. That was a world in tune with nature. But then, from the dark, they came. And with fire came progress, the building of colossal structures and the forging of swords. And they waged war on nature itself. They killed the local fauna, burned down the forests, contaminated the air with pollution, and finally, they built their shining city on a hill. Here, we have a ruling class profiting from the first flame. A bunch of useful idiots preaching for the linking of the first flame, even though it runs contrary to their own interests. Those fighting against the perpetuation of the system, and those pulling the strings of every side of this conflict. The ruling class is self-explanatory and the useful idiots are their followers. Within the context of this subject, those who fight the system have an interesting real-world counterpart, the so-called radical environmental movement. The maintenance of a civilization fueled by the first flame is objectively destroying the world, and those fighting against it are defending not just themselves, but everybody, from a trip to the nearest Thunderdome. However, their actions are admonished as an attack on society. They are branded as fundamentally evil, hunted down, and imprisoned. The undead hunts are the Green Scare. They're the Green Scare. Remember back when there used to be this constant stream of radical environmental actions on the news? People chaining themselves to trees, sabotaging pipelines and bulldozers. Bricks and buckets of paint were thrown. People were very loudly protesting against climate change and animal rights. And for animal rights. What happened to all that? Well, the Green Scare happened. The Green Scare was a legal counter-initiative by the state against environmental activism. They purposefully targeted activists and their supporters in an attempt to scare them into hiding. Fuck, like in 2001, the FBI officially put the Earth Liberation Front at the top of the list of domestic terrorism threats. There were sweeps of arrests and indictments, and ultimately, it worked. Along with a wider effort by different actors that we're going to talk about, the Green Scare fundamentally kneecapped the environmental activism. All those groups were forced underground, some gave up the fight, others continued to fight by less quote-unquote radical means, and some of those individuals were even further radicalized by the experience into ideologies that weren't as justified as their previous ones had been. Remember Savitri Devi from the last chapter? Yeah. Her writings helped build some bridges between far-right groups and radical environmentalists, which culminated with the indoctrination of a number of those disenfranchised individuals over the years. Time is a big, dumb, flat circle. But yeah, with that out of the way, we finally arrive at the most debatable, yet personally the most fascinating piece of this puzzle, the primordial serpents. This is a complicated one to talk about because most people can't seem to agree on what the role of Frampt and Kaf is in the story, but I think it's kind of straightforward. Dark Souls 1 showed us they were working together, which was kind of a mystery at the time, but Dark Souls 3 gave us the answer to that. There, in Dark Souls 3, Lothric, Londor, and the Unkindled are all connected. The whole purpose of the pilgrims is to sacrifice themselves in order to grant dark sigils to a so-called champion of Ash. And the purpose of the sigils is to allow an Unkindled to usurp the first flame, thus becoming the Lord of Londor, which was guided by Kaf. Keeping in mind that Lothric was also under the guidance of the primordial serpents, judging by the statues found in the Grain archives. So, if the purpose of the primordial serpents was to have an undead usurp the first flame, then it stands to reason that they had been driving both the linking and fading. Kaf's champions kept failing at usurpation, as seen in the Dark Lord ending, where we simply walk away from the first flame instead of absorbing it, while Frampt's champions kept the flame alive so that it could be usurped in the first place. There's a lot of details that go into it, but that's the gist of it. And it would be easy to see the serpents as some kind of generic shadow government or fossil fuel industry lobbying group, but I think they were inspired by two very real, very specific people, the Koch brothers. The two really evil ones, Charles and David, not the other two nobody talks about. They're in the fossil fuel industry. Their family and their company worked with both Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Nazi Germany. And when you think about climate change fuckery, there are other companies that come to mind first, right? Like Exxon or Shell. And yes, those two did a lot of fucking around to get us where we are in regards to climate change. But at least the way I see it, they were all using the playbook that was written by the Koch brothers. Charles and David perfected the strategies that are used to manipulate politics from behind the scenes as private citizens. And, perhaps most importantly to this discussion, the strategies that are used to manipulate public discourse when it comes to subjects that are of interest to them. I think, or at least I hope, everybody listening to this knows that oil companies have known about climate change for a very, very long time. Their own scientists had been warning them since the late 50s. And the solution they found for their conundrum wasn't to change what they were doing, it was to preemptively change the public's perception of the scientific debate around climate change. By which I mean they created the illusion of a debate existing at all, since there's always been a consensus that climate change was real, that was their fault, and that we needed to do something about it immediately. They started manipulating institutions of learning, they funded think tanks, and they published papers that directly contradicted the very clear and consistent findings of their own scientists. Time and time again, they kept everyone chasing the wrong problems and fighting the wrong fights, while they just kept on burning shit and ranking in the profits. They made it so there was so much disinformation that the general population just couldn't know for certain what the fuck was going on at any given time. And that's exactly what Frampt, Calf, and all their weird horse teeth droopy cheeks shit eating friends did. They manipulated the state to do their bidding, and they manipulated the public to never actually fight against them. They keep everybody running in circles, fighting each other and all the wrong people, until one day, too much time has passed, and now it's just too fucking late. Dark Souls 1 was a thesis statement saying, this is what's happening. Dark Souls 2 was an open question. Aurea, who's a scholar and quite noticeably an ever-burning piece of wood himself, saw what was happening and wondered if there wasn't another way. Dark Souls 3 was a prophecy and an ultimatum. The mechanisms that produce and perpetuate climate change aren't limited to environmentalism. They drive everything. Economy, politics, culture, war. Everything works together inside the same system, and despite the chaos, the whole system is ticking its way toward a single, common end point. There are things we could do to mitigate its effects, maybe even prevent them, but we don't. We don't do those things because the system won't let us. Because the ruling class will keep us divided and occupied fighting each other instead of fighting them. Instead of fighting the system that gives them this kind of power. It's a rigged game with a fixed outcome. Past and future are predetermined in Soulsborne. Not in any mystical sense, but in the sense that we can't escape the consequences of our choices, even if those choices have been made for us. Gale's future isn't a possible future. That's just the future. It's coming no matter what. Climate change is already here. Its effects are already here. And the worst of it is coming, no matter what, because we can't get our collective shit together in time to stop it. Shell's 1988 internal report on climate change warned them that, given the timescales involved, the people making decisions back then would most likely not see the worst of it come to pass, but that their children would, and their children's children too. Gwyn harnessed the power of the first flame, and Filianor watched the whole world slowly die around her, and the last surviving humans die gasping in the sand where a lake used to be. Fascism and climate change are the two main themes, but there are others, and among those, I think feminism, religion, and class struggle are just as important, even though they're not as well developed. They're important in their own right, they're important because they help paint a full picture of the system that's at play here, and also because they help set four of the fundamental principles of Soulsborne narrative: catamarism, optics, subterfuge, and time. Catamarism, or collapse katamari, is the term I use inside my head for that thing where everything in the lore is connected to everything else. Every character, location, and institution is connected to some degree. Thus, understanding any of those things requires understanding everything else. Of course, that's impossible to do in real life, but it's doable in Soulsborne, which is one of the appeals of lore hunting to me. This is a world that makes sense. It's a bad world, full of bad people, where things happen all the fucking time. But it makes sense. I can piece together all of its many parts and I can just make it work. When it comes to what we've been discussing, that interwoven tissue of elements also means that in order to fight either fascism or climate change, we need to look at all the systems that support them. You wanna fight climate change? You gotta think about colonialism, religion, and the stock market. You wanna fight fascism? You gotta think about trans and women's rights, gerrymandering, and 4chan. So, when we're talking about any of these themes, it's important to keep in mind that they're not working independently from each other. They're all part of the same system. They all tell the same story. So far, we've mostly talked about it in terms of the ruling class versus everybody else. But there are groups that kinda bridge that gap. One particularly prominent example of that are the women of Dark Souls. And this is where the second fundamental principle of Soulsborne narrative comes into play: optics. Just like with fascism, Just like fascism is presented to the player through the lens of the propaganda that fascists use in real life, or how climate change is presented through the misinformation that surrounds that subject in real life. Likewise, Dark Souls presents women as viewed through the eyes of the patriarchy. They are sexualized and vilified, their accomplishments are erased, and their voices go unheard. In the lower classes, we have a broader, more systemic kind of oppression that gets normalized by virtue of their social status. Some examples include arguably Rhea's sacrificial pilgrimage and definitely the maidens kidnapped by Sif. And most noticeably, we also have the Firekeepers. Their importance, their identity, their whole existence is reduced to a single role of servitude. Anastasia is bound, maimed, and ultimately sacrificed. The original Drangleic Firekeepers were burned at the bonfires, and Lothric's Firekeepers are blinded, used, and discarded without ceremony. All of that is considered a common feature of the system that warrants no concerns of morality. That's just how things are. That's just what they do. And then there are goddesses. Women in the ruling class have it much better than their lower class counterparts. They possess more agency and exert more power, but they are still oppressed. According to my theories, first, Fina was Gwyn's wife, and second, Fina, Velka, and Guinevere, and Filianor were all involved in Sif's crossbreed experiments, from which they birthed Gwyndolin, the painter girl Priscilla, and Yorshka, respectively. Those experiments were supposed to benefit all of the gods, but the goddesses were the only ones taking any risks and suffering all of the consequences. Among both mothers and daughters, you find them being imprisoned, exiled, erased, and vilified. And even though we can piece together their story, their oppression goes completely unrecorded by history. For the patriarchy shall not cast dimness upon itself. Women are present from beginning to end, from the Witch of Izalith to Filianor. They drive basically all large-scale semi-progressive social changes in this universe. There's Izalith's Chaos Flame as an alternative to the First Flame. There's the goddesses of Anor Londo's participation in the Undead Rebellion. Guinevere's integration of miracles, pyromancy, and hexes and Haiti. Gwyndolin opening Anor Londo to the rest of the world. And the Sable Sisters' participation in founding Londor. But they have to operate within the system, so whatever power they get, it must be taken. They are often forced to exert that power from the shadows. Their many accomplishments are overshadowed by their patriarchy counterparts, and in the end, one way or another, that same system will eventually see to it that they lose everything they got. Dark Souls doesn't paint them as flawless beacons of... I'm sorry. Dark Souls doesn't paint them as flawless beacons of righteousness. There are many problems with how they approach things, and they do make mistakes along the way. But they are oppressed, and they are always fighting, and their fight does bring progress to everyone. The point of the trilogy isn't that feminism as it exists today is perfect, because no ideology or social movement is perfect. The point of the trilogy is that feminism is worth fighting for. Class struggle in Dark Souls is one of the most obvious themes. In this feudal-like state, classes are well defined and exploitation is explicit. The world has wealthy rulers and everyone else living beneath them. Quite literally, I might add, from the chained giants who must have built the city of the gods, through the eternally toiling miners of Tseldora, all the way to the starving masses of the undead settlement, waiting to be sacrificed. through labor and worship with their blood and their souls. Everyone must pay tribute. Control of the masses is maintained not only through a monopoly of violence, carried out primarily by the undead hunts, but through more underhanded means as well. They are told to accept their lot in life, and to be thankful for the blessings they receive from their rulers. They are atomized to the point where cooperation requires sacrifice. A middle class is propped as a bulwark to whom the worst of the suffering will be spared in exchange for their collaboration in oppressing their own king. And even limited political representation will be offered from time to time, with the caveat that should those representatives choose to serve their brethren rather than their lords, such as the four kings, the floodgates will be flung open. It's only natural, you see, to drown the devout, miracle-casting mothers with babies still clinging to their chests. For there were agitators in their midst. And honestly, we had already built a floodgate on your human settlement. Did you expect us not to use it? So I wanted to make a couple of side notes first. I wanted to explain what I meant by atomization to the point of sacrifice. Because we need to revert hollowing to engage in cooperation in Dark Souls 1, and to do that we need to burn humanities, which we need to get from other people, right? So yeah, we need to prey on other humans in order to collaborate with other humans. And that's what I meant by atomization, that makes it so that cooperation requires sacrifice. And a second side note is something that I thought about while editing the video. There's like the... And there's also the Dark Wraiths, right? From Cal's Covenant, from New Londo, and they use the Dark Hand. And like, they have this reputation for being like bad, basically, because they invade and such, but like, they're part of the rebellion, right? Imagine like the image that they present themselves with, the mask, the skull, like it doesn't have that same association we have in our world, in Lordran, right? In the world of Dark Souls, that doesn't have to make them like evil. They're not Skeletor. And when it comes to the Dark Hand stealing humanity, like, think about it. First, the Dark Hand itself, its primary use is either for stealing humanities or as a shield, right? In Dark Souls 1 you could also, I think you could parry with it, but it was either for stealing humanities or defensive equipment, right? Because they had actual weapons. The Dark Wraith, they had swords and stuff. And when it comes to stealing humanity, because that's supposed to be like this big bad thing that they do, right? But think about it. If you have a surplus of humanity, you're getting that humanity from somewhere. Where are you getting your humanities from, Mr. Victim? Those humanities came from other people, right? And the Dark Hand itself, like when it steals humanities, it doesn't even deal damage. So if they have people that are hoarding if there are people around that would be opposed to the rebellion, that would be enemies to the Dark Wraiths, it would make sense to get those humanities from those people, and the Dark Hand itself is a very quote-unquote humane tool for doing that. It doesn't deal damage, and the invasions too, like, From a player perspective, that's very evil because it fucks with our playthrough. But like, if they're invading, they're also not getting humanities from anybody in their own world, right? When they're invading, and we don't know who they're getting their humanities from. When they're going to these other worlds, when they're invading other worlds, they can. Sorry about that. Don't wait, everybody. So yeah, when they do their invasions, they can get humanities from other scumbags in other worlds, hurting humanities from other people that they're hurting in other worlds as well, right? So yeah, that was something interesting that I thought about. Okay, back to the video. Now, when talking about class struggle, a lot of us will have a knee-jerk reaction of pointing at Dark Souls and screaming capitalism. And while, yes, indeed, capitalism, I also gotta say no, not capitalism. Kind of. The thing is, there's no actual in-universe capitalism here. The modes of production and circulation of currency necessary for the accumulation of capital don't really exist in Dark Souls. With that being said, though, this is still an allegory for capitalism. And I say that because, first, fascism and climate change set a precedent for Dark Souls referencing modern issues. Second, it wouldn't make sense for them to equate their currency to souls if this wasn't about capitalism, since the analogy would be lost in a purely feudal environment. And finally, the end of history and the last man. Fukuyama's book talks about the end of history and the last man. Fukuyama's book talks about how, after the Cold War, humanity had reached the apex of political theory in the form of Western liberal democracy, with all that entails, a rousing endorsement of capitalism included. From that point forward, regardless of the directions the world might take, political thinking would never, and could never, evolve again. Back to Dark Souls. There is no visual artistic representation of the title The End of History in The Last Man, more striking than the fight against Gale at the end of time. That was the end of human history, and we were the last man. Taking into consideration everything we've discussed thus far, the end of the Dark Souls trilogy seems like a condemnation of Fukuyama's thinking. His writing ignores all the suffering and inequality present and produced by his ideal system. It negates the exercise of critical thinking and the very possibility of that which might be. No better alternative can ever be found, because no better alternative could ever exist. The way I see it, Miyazaki's verdict is that if history truly has ended, then collapse is the only possibility left. And this leads us to the third principle of Soulsborne narrative, subterfuge. The lore is notoriously vague and obscure, but still, most references are much more direct than that which we find in regards to capitalism. Why is that? Well, to put it plainly, certain subjects are simply not allowed in mainstream media. If it's an indie production or a self-published book, then yeah, sure, you can talk about whatever you want. But generally speaking, if you're pitching to an actual studio, then no. Some things you're just not supposed to talk about. You can have the aesthetics of anti-capitalism, but not an actual anti-capitalist message. In some cases, that's more of a cynical attempt to commodify public dissatisfaction. Maybe the story has like an evil company, but the system is fine, which is probably the most common type. Or they start with a clear anti-capitalist message, but that gets replaced by other subjects, such as with Severance or Mr. Robot. On the other hand, we have art that truly aims to be anti-capitalist, but that needs to compromise in order to get the funding it needs. That's where you get what I call the Pollokification of politics. The message needs to be so convoluted that the only people who will read the text as intended are the people who already think that way. Everybody else gets a free pass to decide what the message was, regardless of the artist's intent. I think Parasite probably falls in that category, and so does Dark Souls. My favorite example of this is probably Jinro, the Wolf Brigade. This is a Japanese animation set in the 50s of an alternate history where Nazi Germany won the war in Europe and eventually occupied Japan, who had joined the Allies. They set an authoritarian state, there's public unrest, and the paramilitary counter-terrorist law enforcement branch called Kerberos is created. They're Nazi-looking, brutal, well-armed, and the other branches of law enforcement don't like them too much, thinking Kerberos might become too powerful and threaten their position within their government. The public obviously doesn't like him too much either. There's a bunch of fuckery between the branches, and in the end, there's this internal group within Kerberos, the paramilitary branch, and they see the days of their unity is over, so they decide to leave that particular organization behind so they can continue operating within the government, making sure their quote-unquote ideals continue to be upheld by the system, even if they're not shooting as many people as they used to. And I only ever see people talking about this movie in two ways. First, there's people saying this is a deep philosophical exploration of the human soul, which it is, with this element being present in parts of the story I didn't mention in the summary. And second, there's people explaining that this is a movie about Nazi bad, which, again, it is Nazi bad. But neither of these is the actual point of the movie. Focusing only on the philosophical aspect ignores the blatant politics of the story, and focusing just on the Nazis, or even just on World War II, occupation and reconstruction, ignores the contemporary politics of the people who made the movie. One of the no-go subjects in Japanese media is Imperial Japan. Imperial Japan in World War II was just straight up evil. Nanjing, Manchukuo. But a lot of people here deny those things ever happened. Regular people, history books, the government. I've had Japanese co-workers tell me that kind of bullshit to my face, this kind of history denial. So, if you're making a movie or a video game in Japan, you're kinda not supposed to talk about that. But even worse than that, there's Nobusuke Goddamn Kishi. Kishi was a prime minister, leader of the Liberal Democratic Party that governed almost uninterruptedly since it was founded in 55, and he was grandfather of Shinzo Abe, longest serving prime minister who got clapped with a homebrew shotgun. The thing is, though, Kishi was also a horror movie levels of war crimes motherfucker. Only, instead of hanging from a noose, the United States just let him go back into politics, along with a whole bunch of his war crime buddies. And as you can imagine, you're not supposed to talk about any of that either. So, what do you do if you're an artist who wants to talk about that? Well, you use subterfuge. And you make Jinro, a movie about what if the World War II fascists ruled Japan after the war, and then went on to rebrand themselves so they could continue ruling and pushing their ideology into the mainstream long after it had fallen out of fashion to be a fascist out in the open. This statement, this thesis, is blatantly presented at the very beginning of the movie. Through subterfuge. The movie starts by saying, if it looks like a wolf, then it is a wolf, and it must be killed. There are things Dark Souls isn't allowed to talk about. At least, not out in the open. The process of lore hunting isn't just about figuring out the story of this video game. It's about giving you the skills to figure shit out in real life. And that includes figuring out just what the fuck the art you're consuming is actually talking about. And thus we have reached the last subject. Faith and religions are just facts of Dark Souls. They're an inescapable part of its world building, arguably the most ubiquitous theme, possibly the most controversial, and yet relatively underdeveloped. Think about it. What do we actually know about their faith? Humans don't seem to know about the first man or the ringed city or the furtive pygmy was so easily forgotten. When we start playing the first game, no human alive has ever set foot in the kiln of the first flame or seen an ancient dragon even. They don't seem to know the gods came from the dark or that they created the dark side. What is it that they actually believe? Do they have a creation myth? Where do they think the world came from, or even the first flame? Do they think the gods created the first flame? Do they believe in the afterlife? Do they have a myth for the end of the world? Gwyn is the Lord of Sunlight. Okay, what do they think the sun is? What about the moon? Do they have any myths about what lurks in the deepest reaches of the sea? What happens to their souls if they worship the gods? What happens if they don't? We don't know what the tenets of their faith are. And we're not told that because they're not important for the analysis presented by these games. The point isn't that any given type of religion functions in a certain way. The point is that regardless of whatever differences may exist between them, on the most fundamental level, religions as a whole effectively serve the same function, which means they all lead to a common outcome. Starting with Dark Souls 2, Drangleic is kind of separate from the progression of faith between Dark Souls 1 and 3, but it is still worth noting that, despite Vendrick's lukewarm attitude toward the church, they still can't rid themselves of that institution entirely. They still need to exist in a world that is influenced by the effects of religion in its history. They still need to contend with a existential threat mandated by the gods, and they still need to function within a system that revolves around the existence of the first flame. In Dark Souls 1, the gods, the literal embodiment of religion, hold all political power. Faith in religion dictate every aspect of society, not just in Lordran, but also through their representatives in the outside world, of whom the most noticeable example is probably of Allfather Lloyd, leader of the paramilitary branch responsible for the undead hunts. This is a theocracy in every sense of the word, and the worship of Anor gods is the only kind of acceptable faith left. And once we get to Lothric, the state is above the church, but not above the faith. The linking of the first flame has become an institutional effort, and even without the rule of the gods, they still feed the fire for fire's sake. Dogmatic tradition is a law not even monarchs can escape. Heathen beliefs test their faith, and at this pivotal moment for the kingdom, the Sable Church knocks at Lothric's doors, while the angelic faith sprouts from within. Now, how do these religions affect the world and its people? Well, two common factors seem to work as a through line: conflict and devotion. Religions are inherently exclusionary. By definition, different religions will contradict each other, and they can't all be true at the same time. And since most religions trade in fundamental existential aspects of life, such as where did we all come from, where are we going to, and how do we get there? All religions have an othering and dehumanizing effect on heretics. Regardless of what their teachings may be, this is an inherent feature of faith that can lead to anything from pity to spite or even hate. On a basic level, heretics are simply devoid of grace. Not Elden Ring's kind of grace, we're not there yet, just the generic kind of divine grace. They're unworthy of God's blessing in salvation. Whenever we get to whatever version of heaven my particular religion subscribes to, these people won't be there. And if God doesn't love them enough to save them, then how does that affect the way I should feel about this lot? How good are they really if they're unwilling or unable to be saved? How human can they really be? Brazilian Spiritism and religions that believe in a samsara-like concept have a more transient and yet more guttural expression of this effect, I think. For them, people outside the faith are literally unevolved. They will eventually become complete human beings, yes, but right now, not so much. And all this is a best case scenario. On a more extreme level, heretics are just plain evil. Something to be hated, something to be killed. And, with all this in mind, it's no surprise that religions would be so consistently tied to conflict, right? Crusades, jihads, and pogroms, the war on Izalith, and the undead hunt. When it comes to the second point of that through line, which is devotion, its mechanisms also don't need to be outright spoken, but they're effectively codified by dogmas. Much like Fukuyama's view of capitalism, Dogmas preclude critical thinking. You're not supposed to question something you have accepted as divinely ordained. When God tells you,
Abraham, kill me a son,
the only question you're allowed to ask is,
where do you want this killing done?
dogmas impose a set of rules you're supposed to follow, not because they're intrinsically reasonable or good, but simply because you were told to. In a broader sense, this is illustrated by humans worshipping and linking the first flame, even though that very same flame is the means by which the gods had cursed them. And Dark Souls 3, in particular, seems very keen on this kind of argument. Its religions place great faith in the words of the blind, and some of the tales relayed by the saints paint a clear picture of the subject in action, even if their exact words aren't made known to us. Darkmoon Blade shows us clergy preaching words they don't fully comprehend, saying, "Miracles of the Dark Moon are tales of revenge," but Captain Yoshka recites only for the sake of remembering her brother, without knowledge of its meaning. Atonement is an example of how followers can learn and believe in everything they're taught, without fully understanding the consequences they might be inviting upon themselves. Miracle given to those cast out from the Sable Church of Londor attracts more attention from foes. This is the only tale known by exiles, who believe it carries words of forgiveness. Cursed journeys, too, must ultimately come to an end. Projected Heal is just people making shit up as they go, I guess. Even those who had forgotten the caress and bounty of the Princess of Sunlight did their best to recall her image. The stories spun about her were most certainly childish and yet gravely sincere. And Divine Pillars of Light is, well, the Queen's holy maiden Gertrude was visited by an angel who revealed this tale to her. Despite losing both her sight and voice, she was determined to record the tale. Ordinary men cannot decipher her fragmentary scroll, nor comprehend how it became the foundation of the angelic faith of Lothric. They can't even read her fucking words, man. These examples are very explicit, but some more subtle methods can be as simple as how powers are named. Miracles are magical powers just like any other power in this world. But unlike pyromancies, necromancies, and sorceries, miracles carry a moralistic connotation just by virtue of being called miracles. They are supposed to be inherently good, and they are supposed to be derived from and bolstered by worshipping the gods. But that's demonstrably untrue, right? Miracles can do all kinds of shit. And if your faith is high enough, if your willpower is strong enough, your miracles will be that much more powerful, regardless of whether you link the flame or let it fade. The material benefits of faith can be achieved without the religions that are supposedly attached to them. Reminding ourselves that Dark Souls isn't criticizing any specific real-world religions, and that it isn't even criticizing followers. Some people take it upon themselves to do bad things and use religion as a justification, yes. Generally speaking, though, followers seem to be deceived into believing bad things are actually good, either by specific groups or even by the lingering influence of religion in the society they live in. In the end, devotion translates to a system that allows individuals to control their followers, often against their self-interest. And when coupled with the exclusionary, conflict-oriented nature of faith, That's often done by pitting them against others. Like Shakespeare once wrote, "'Tis the time's plague when madmen lead the blind." And speaking of time, now's the perfect moment to talk about that last fundamental principle of Soulsborne narrative, right? Dark Souls and Soulsborne as a whole, as we'll talk about later, has always been preoccupied with the effects of time. And religion, I believe, is the subject that more thoroughly takes advantage of this concept. The dominant institution goes from being headed by the gods to following their traditions despite their absence. Its position flips from persecuting other religions to having to defend itself against religions born out of that same persecution. And instead of having faith-based politics, the world now grapples with politics-oriented faith. The precise mechanisms of religion have changed drastically over the ages, but its presence and effects are constant and unchanged. And I need a water break now. And here, at the end, I believe it's time to finally talk about Londor and the Sable Church, which is arguably the most interesting religion in Dark Souls, and probably not what most people believe it to be. Opinions about the Sable Church usually fall in one of two camps, either utter contempt for those in the from those in the community who, against all reason, sympathize with the gods and their legacy, or unwavering devotion from those who side with the dark. The truth, however, is more complicated than that. And, before we continue, it's worth noting that, regardless of what follows in this analysis, the first flame-based denominations are clearly the most damaging ones. These are the ones holding humanity shackled to the yoke of life. They whitewash the memory of the gods and perpetuate the system of control they had instituted through the dark sign. Now, the state of hollowing itself is often presented as the main argument in favor of linking the first flame, since losing one's mind and existing forever as a walking beef jerky sounds like a fate worse than death. But not only is body shaming childish, this perceived aesthetic downgrade seems like a small price to pay for immortality, if you ask me. And when it comes to the infamous madness of the accursed hollows, well, hollowing doesn't actually make you insane. Our characters hollow quite a bit without ever losing their mind. Even the bearer of the curse can regain their memories with some simple therapy. The most hollowed individuals we find in-game still demonstrate the ability to cooperate among themselves and with others. They can choose to chill and appreciate the nostalgic scenery of New Londo if they don't feel threatened. And most importantly, Londor stands as evidence that hollows are still in control of their faculties. They built their own kingdom with their own politics, culture, and religion. These people are not insane. Have you ever seen a hollow? They're not mad, they're starving. And they're frightened. Of course they're going to attack strangers on sight. And let's be honest here, we're usually the ones wreaking havoc in their neighborhoods, right? So, why do people say hollows go mad? In-universe, why do they do that? Well, think back to what we talked about regarding optics. The Divine Tome of Londor says, "This is a forbidden tome, as it offers salvation to all hollows, and conversely curses all things living." Well, Why would Londor forbid their own sacred texts for offering salvation to their own hallowed citizens? Well, they obviously wouldn't. This is an outside perspective. This is how Lothric talks about Londor. Likewise, when that again says the Hollow Realm is a society of undead, comprised of the corpses and shades of those who led unsavory lives. This is how outsiders think about them. This is just in-universe bigots throwing shade at the dark. Now think about the fascism we also talked about. We start the first game locked up in a concentration camp, and neurodivergency was notoriously used by fascists as an excuse to lock a whole lot of people up. Not satisfied by branding us with the dark sign, the gods also branded us with a label that makes us a group that needs to be removed from civilized society. The madness of hollows is a fabrication, a myth. That's just another tool of oppression devised by the ruling class. So, with that out of the way, let us address the dark side of Londor, shall we? The Sable Church is a direct descendant of the Undead Rebellion. And not just in a general ideological sense either. Not completely unlike the Angelic Faith, the original rebellion sprung from within the Way of White, which is demonstrated among other things by Havel's involvement, who was a bishop of that religion, and the fact that the technology of the occult upgrade path was a fork of the research previously conducted by the divine upgrade path. They were guided by Kaf with Velka and Fina support, and in the aftermath of their defeat, its remnants continued reforming the Way of White from the inside. We can see the initial stages of this reformation process exemplified by Petrus, Oswald, and Lothric. Then, in Dark Souls 3, Karin has fully replaced Torrelland, and their Firekeepers must be ordained in Lothric, where Rosaria/Fina was the queen, and where saints who weren't agreeable with the dark were thus rejected, as exemplified by Irina. And finally, we get the Hollow's Ashes, directly linking Lothric to the creation of Londor, still influenced by Velka, still with Fina support, and still guided by Kaf. This intersection of faith and time illustrates more than a progression, but an outright transformation. The rebellion had members of the clergy, but all evidence suggests that it was a political movement of liberation, that it wasn't driven by faith. Some goddesses were involved, but there was no sign of worship. Where once the rebellion fought against the oppression of the gods and their religion, the Sable Church now adopts the tactics of its former enemies. They preach tales instead of teaching ideas, while the Sable Sisters dress in a crow-like attire to dispense miracles of Velka. Having no gods left to fight, Londor fights their brothers and sisters, albeit by virtue of circumstance, and blind faith leads exiles astray, while devotion turns followers into martyrs, ready to let themselves be infected and sacrificed for a goal they can't even comprehend. That goal, in fact, may very well be the most illustrative signifier of how far the movement had strayed. In Dark Souls 1, the means for usurpation of fire didn't exist yet, so the goal of the rebellion was to let the first flame fade, while the so-called Dark Lord ascended in anonymity. They were breaking their chains and giving themselves the chance to build something new. When it comes to the Sable Church, though, Fading has become a quaint idea of a long-forgotten past, ordained by the first flame they once sought to extinguish. The Lord of Hollows is a true lord in its own right. The Hollow Realm seeks not to undo the sins of the past, but to repeat them. Faith is law, and a ruling class shall lord over the rest of us, until their lords have nothing left to rule but a barren wasteland. Looking at it in a vacuum, the point of Dark Souls 3 seems to be that of passing judgment on order. But nothing happens in isolation from the rest. The serpents had always been there, manipulating every piece on the board, pitting us all against each other. With the right application of optic subterfuge and time, they had us all running in circles, fighting against our own self-interests. Fighting so that they could fuck off with the first flame. Fighting so that they could achieve their goals. Freedom cannot be given. It must be taken. Fighting in and of itself is always necessary, but never enough. We must come together. We must learn the face of our enemies, and we must always know what we are fighting for. In a long enough timeline, even the very concept of truth may die. This all happened before, and it will all happen again. The entirety of history happens to the tune of linking and fading of the first flame. Endless cycles unto eternity. And that's history so far, maybe until the bitter end. But there is another way of looking at the passage of time as it's told by Dark Souls. Nothing ever happens in isolation from the whole. Everything can be traced back to its roots. And that means everything that exists today will be the source of something else. And sure, that will probably be just another step on the endless cycle, yes. But still, every single choice we make, either collectively or individually, no matter how big or how small, has the potential to help create something new. A brand new world is always possible, so long as we choose to take that first step. Okay, this is the end of the first part of the first video of me talking about Soulsborne politics, I guess. I've been meaning to make these videos for a very long time now. Like, I started trying to make them a number of times. I've been talking about my opinions on these subjects since forever, basically, on Patreon. Bits and pieces here and there. It just took me this long to put everything together. Hopefully in a way that makes sense. Like, there's too much to talk about. Literally, there's way too much stuff to talk about regarding every single game and every single subject. There's endless amounts of references. And I don't know. I think this structure is going to work. I'm hoping that it will. And I'm hoping that I am saying what needs to be said regarding everything. Like, I'm hoping it's enough. Yeah. There's a few side notes that I want to make here at the end. First, regarding The Lightning and the Sun, the book that I mentioned up there about fascism and esoteric fucking Hitlerism. If you want to do your own research and see what that's all about, then yeah, sure, go ahead and read it. I just don't recommend doing that just because it's so fucking bad. It's awful. Like, it sucks so much trying to read that bullshit. Your brain's going to beg for mercy. So, no, I don't recommend it. Like, if you want to, sure, go ahead. Don't buy it. Don't give them money. Find it online. You can find it online. But yeah, if you just want to read more about fascism and its history and how it works, one book that I can recommend is The Death of Democracy. I think it does a very good job at it's it has a good balance balance between being informative and approachable. I think that's a good one. Okay. Regarding feminism, I really wanted to make a side note there. Like, it was very short, right? The sections about, particularly about feminism and capitalism, they were very short. They were much short. They were shorter than the other sections. Faith kind of shortish, but not really. It's like these three last subjects, they're not as thoroughly explored by these games as I believe fascism and oppression particularly were. Like, capitalism is tied to class struggle. Like, I hope I made that clear. Like, it's about class struggle, but it's about capitalism. But yeah, like, there's less to talk about in regards to those, but they are still definitely present and discussed by the games, and they needed to be addressed. They're important on the, like I said, they're important on their own right, and they're important on the whole. Like, you need them to paint the full picture. Regarding feminism in particular, there's been a few videos about feminism in Soulsborne games coming out lately, I guess. I don't know time anymore. And I, yeah, they're good, I guess. I liked some of them. I think my favorite one, my favorite creator in that regard, I think it's she's called Cupcake Souls, her channel. She's new to the scene, and when she talks about Soulsborne, I think it's always about feminism. And I don't agree with everything she says in her video, especially when it comes to her interpretations of the lore. But generally speaking, I like her takes. I think she did a great job, and it's definitely worth checking it out if you haven't. Say hi. Tell her I said hi if you go there. Yeah. And I can't forget, I also forgot to mention both in the main video and the side notes that there's Fina, right? Like, Fina is almost definitely the character with the most lore in the entire trilogy. She's always been there, she's this constant through line through the history of these games. Her presence her influence and presence are felt in every aspect of politics, even when society tries to reduce her to this trophy wife, baby incubator role. She's always there doing her thing, right? Her achievements just aren't a matter of public record because society, the scholars, the historians, the patriarchy are more interested in chronicling the achievements and the legacy of their kings and such. So yeah, there's that. Regarding the Sable Church, I have a weird side note here. They remind me of the Mujahideen. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. But yeah, I didn't mention that in the video proper because I don't actually think this was an actual source of inspiration for the game. There's not enough parallels there. There's some fundamental differences that don't make it compatible enough. But yeah, they remind me of the Mujahideen. Like they started as this political movement for independence, right, of Afghanistan. And their members were, of course, very religious. It's Afghanistan, but the movement itself wasn't religious in nature, right? It was a political movement of independence until the CIA decided it was a good idea to infuse the movement with fundamentalism, right? Islamic fundamentalism. Like the Taliban. I'm not saying. Yeah, another reason why I didn't mention this in the video proper, it's because I'm not saying the Sable Church is the Taliban, God's sake, but the Taliban, they weren't born in Afghanistan, right? They came from Pakistan, and they brought fundamentalism with them and infused the movement with that, and you get everything that came after that, right? It fundamentally changed how the movement worked, their goals. Yeah. So, and lastly, the last side note that I want to make is like we're talking about themes, right? I still don't know what the at the time of recording this video, I still don't know what the title of the video is going to be exactly. Soulsborne themes, Soulsborne and politics, philosophy of Soulsborne, I don't know. But we're talking about themes, about philosophy basically. And like I often see, I think it's more common to see people talking about the philosophy of these games in terms of like this, what's the word? English? What's the word? Didactical? What? I don't know. Like in terms of quote unquote pure philosophy, right? But like, so to discuss, like, I don't know, I made a video talking about Camus and absurdism in Dark Souls. Like, if you want to see my opinions about that, you can check that video out, The Absurdity of Dark Souls, or they'll discuss, I don't know, Kant or whomever. Hang on, but like, and they do it in isolation from all the blatant politics that are present in these games. The text is explicitly political, right? It's like the example I gave regarding Jinro. Like, you can talk about that personal arc that's supposedly there. It's complicated to talk about that. It's not pertinent here, but yeah. Separate from the actual politics of the movie, but not only that does a disservice to the art itself and to the artists that made it, that also misses the point of philosophy in the first place. The point of philosophy is to understand life, to understand yourself, to understand life, the world, how everything works, so that you can live your life, so that you can navigate the world. Philosophy without philosophy that disregards a practical application is meaningless. It's if you talk just about that and ignore the rest, that's just jerking off the fucking brain, right? It's just useless rhetoric. So yeah, while I think it's important and interesting to talk about that aspect, I think it's essential to talk about this one too, the politics, right? How the philosophy of these games translates to the real world. So yeah, that's that. This was part one. There's two more parts. I don't know yet if those two parts are going to be two videos or just one more video. But they're coming. I will know by the time this video is out to the public. Yeah. In the meantime, thank you all very much for watching. Thank you, as always, to my lovely patrons. Sinclair Lord, Balan, New Vampire, Sam D, Hubal, Taylor Reed, Medium Hat Logan, Derp, Brain Douche, Mr. Pudding, and Dom Sparks. I love you all very much. Thank you all very much for your support. Everybody, please do stay safe, and I'll see you around. Bye bye.